The wind off Cook Inlet came in sideways that evening, carrying the smell of diesel and low tide cutting through the thin, ragged coat wrapped around Grant Sorensen's shoulders. He sat on an overturned milk crate outside a shuttered hardware store on 4th Avenue, his knees drawn to his chest, his breath rising in pale clouds that the streetlights turned gold for a moment before the dark swallowed them whole. "Oh my God. Oh my God, Taylor, look." The voice cut through the cold like a blade. Grant did not lift his head right away. He had learned over the last several days that it was safer not to. "No way. No way, that's him." A second voice, younger, delighted in the way cruelty is delighted when it believes itself to be justice. "That's Grant Sorensen. That is the Grant Sorensen." "Oh my gosh, Brooke, get your phone out." He looked up then because some part of him, the part that had not yet learned to disappear completely still, expected absurdly to be greeted like a person. Two young women stood at the mouth of the alley. Phones already raised the blue-white glow of their screens, washing over faces he almost recognized from a decade ago from another life. Entirely a golf clubhouse, a fundraising gala, a name tag that had once read Sorensen Fisheries Junior Partner, before the world had learned what that name would come to mean. "Big Dreams Boy," the one called Brooke said, drawing the words out like she was savoring them. "Remember that. That's what everybody called you back at Diamond before you got so full of yourself. Big Dreams Boy's gonna own the whole harbor someday. Big Dreams Boy's gonna be somebody." She laughed, and it was not a warm sound. "Look at you now. You look like something that washed up with the tide." "Get a shot of his hands," Taylor said, delighted. "This is going straight up. Nobody's gonna believe it." Grant said nothing. He had trained himself these last 21 days not to flinch, not to explain, not to reach for the version of himself that could end this in one sentence. "I own 11 fish processing plants between here and Kodiak. I employ 600 people. I could buy this block and everything on it before breakfast." That man was folded up somewhere deep inside him, now tucked away like a coat he wasn't allowed to wear. "Please," he said instead, and his voice came out rough, unused, smaller than he meant it to. "I don't want any trouble." Trouble. Brooke stepped closer, and for a moment there was something almost curious in her face, the way people look at roadkill. Not cruelty exactly, just a total absence of the instinct to look away. "You're the trouble, sweetheart. You're an embarrassment. Your dad used to have a boat, right? I remember my mom talking about it. Guess the whole family just runs downhill." The word dad landed somewhere under his ribs and stayed there burning. They filmed for another 30 seconds. His stillness, his silence, the newspaper stuffed into the gap where his left boot sole had come loose, and then they were gone, laughing, their voices swallowed by the wind, leaving him alone again with the cold and the orange sodium light, and the low hum of a city that did not know who he was, and worse, did not care. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. He exhaled slowly. 21 days. 3 weeks of sleeping in the loading bay behind a shuttered cannery, of standing in soup kitchen lines with his head down, of learning. Really learning in his bones, not in the abstract boardroom way. He'd always assumed he understood what it meant to be hungry in a way that never fully went away, to be cold in a way that settled into the joints and stayed there even in sleep, to be looked at and not seen. He had done this to himself. He reminded himself of that fact the way a man reminds himself of a debt he has to pay. He had walked away from the penthouse on L Street, away from the glass-walled office with his name etched into the door, away from board meetings and charity dinners where people said his name like it was a blessing they wanted some of. And he had done it because somewhere in the last few years he had stopped being able to tell the difference between the people who loved him and the people who loved what he could give them. "You'll never be able to trust anyone again," his lawyer had told him, not unkindly, when Grant had first explained the plan. Not really. Not after this much money. Maybe that was true. But Grant Sorensen had grown up believing, had been raised by a father who worked 18-hour days on a boat that smelled of salt and diesel, and hoped that a person's worth had nothing to do with what sat in his bank account. And somewhere along the way to becoming one of the wealthiest men in the state of Alaska, he had lost the ability to know for certain whether anyone around him still believed that too. So he had disappeared. He had let his beard grow in patchy and uneven. He had bought second-hand boots 2 sizes too big from a thrift store using cash, so the transaction would never trace back to him, and he had walked out into the city that had made him to find out once and for all whether kindness still existed in a world that had taught him it did not. The wind picked up and Grant pulled his knees in tighter, pressing his back against the cold brick, and for a moment, just a moment, the noise of the street fell away, and he was 12 years old again. He was standing in the doorway of a small house on the edge of turn-again rain, hammering the tin roof, and his mother was gone. Not gone the way people are gone when they step out for groceries. Gone the way a lamp goes out suddenly completely with no flicker of warning beforehand. He remembered his father's face that morning, gray and hollowed out. Remembered being told in a voice that did not invite questions that his mother had left, that she was not coming back, that he was not to ask again. He remembered more than anything the silence that followed, a silence that had lived in that house for years afterward, thick as fog, and that Grant had never once in over 2 decades found the courage to walk into and ask what it was. Hiding. He had built an empire out of that silence. Every processing plant, every fishing contract, every zero added to the end of his net worth, all of it, if he was honest with himself, had been an attempt to fill a hole that money had never once come close to touching. A siren wailed somewhere, blocks away, and faded. Somewhere behind a dumpster across the street, a stray cat picked its way through the shadows, pausing to look at him with flat, indifferent eyes before disappearing again. Grant did not move. He sat very still the way he had learned to over these 3 weeks, watching, waiting, letting the city do to him what it would, because somewhere out there, he told himself, gripping the thought like a man gripping a rope in open water, there had to be one person left who would look at a stranger, freezing on a street corner, and see not an embarrassment, not a joke for a phone screen, but simply a man who was cold and hungry, and in need of a little grace. He did not know not yet that 3 blocks away in a small apartment above a laundromat, a young woman named Emily Carter was folding the last of her paycheck into an envelope marked rent, utterly unaware that her life and his was about to change forever. The wind kept blowing, and Grant Sorensen, billionaire orphan of his own silence, waited. The bell above the door of Kowalski's diner gave a tired little jingle as Emily Carter pushed inside, stamping the slush from her boots on the mat, her cheeks pink from the cold and her dark ponytail damp with the fine needling snow that had started falling somewhere around 6 o'clock. It was the kind of Anchorage evening that made the whole city feel like it was holding its breath. Streetlights haloed in mist exhaust, curling up from parked cars like something alive, the mountains beyond the harbor swallowed whole by low gray cloud. "There she is," said Mrs. Kowalski from behind the counter, not looking up from the grill where she was scraping down the flat top with practiced, unhurried strokes. "Long day at the plant, honey, you have no idea." Emily slid onto a stool at the counter, peeling off her gloves finger by finger. "Derek had me redo the Kodiak shipment manifest 4 times. 4 times, Mrs. K. I think he just likes watching me suffer. Derek likes watching everybody suffer. It's not personal." The older woman set a chipped white mug of coffee in front of her without being asked, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a foil-wrapped bundle, sliding it across the formica like it was nothing at all, like it hadn't been quietly happening 3 or 4 evenings a week for longer than either of them cared to count. "For the fella out front. If he's still there." Emily glanced toward the fogged front window. Through the smeared glass half obscured by a hand-lettered sign advertising the soup of the day, she could just make out a shape huddled against the brick, 2 doors down, knees drawn up, shoulders hunched into a coat that looked like it belonged to a much larger, much longer ago man. "He's still there," she said quietly. She had first noticed him nearly 3 weeks earlier on a night not unlike this one, cold enough to make her chest ache, walking the 4 blocks from the bus stop, cold enough that she had almost kept walking past him the way most people did, eyes forward, pace quick. The particular blindness that a city teaches its people when looking costs something. But something about the stillness of him had stopped her. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't rattled a cup or called out. He had simply sat there upright, dignified in a way that seemed almost stubborn, as if some part of him refused to fully collapse no matter how far he had fallen. She had bought him a coffee that first night, mostly on instinct, the way her father used to buy coffee for the men who sometimes slept behind the church on Northern Lights. "You don't have to know a man's whole story to know he's cold," her father used to say. Cold doesn't wait for a resume. He had died when Emily was 16, and she still heard his voice sometimes in moments exactly like this one, steering her hand toward the register before her mind had finished deciding. She wrapped her scarf tighter and stepped back out into the snow. "Evening," she said, crouching a little so she wasn't looming over him. "Brought you something. It's just meatloaf, but Mrs. K makes it better than anybody has a right to." The man looked up, and for a fraction of a second, so brief she would later wonder if she'd imagined it, something flickered across his face that didn't belong there. Not gratitude exactly. Something closer to disbelief, as if he were waiting for the foil-wrapped plate to be snatched back, or for this to reveal itself as a joke at his expense. Then it passed, and he took the food with both hands carefully, the way a man handles something he's afraid of dropping. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, a little rough from disuse, but there was something underneath it, an unexpected clarity, a precision to the words that didn't quite match the rest of him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She smiled, straightening up. "That's kind of the point." He studied her for a moment, and there was something almost startled in the way he looked at her, like a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. "What's your name?" "Emily." She hesitated, then added, "Emily Carter." "Grant," he said. Then after a pause, just long enough to notice just Grant. She didn't push for more. In her experience, people carrying that much weight told you their stories when they were ready, not before, and pressing only ever made them pull further into themselves. She said good night, told him Mrs. Kowalski usually had leftovers around this time most evenings, and walked back into the warm, grease-scented light of the diner without looking back, never once suspecting that the man behind her had, for the first time in 21 days, felt something in his chest come dangerously close to hope. The next morning, the apartment Emily shared with her mother smelled like burnt coffee and hairspray, and Diane Carter was standing in the middle of the living room in her bathrobe, waving a folded copy of the Anchorage Daily News like a woman brandishing evidence in a courtroom. "Preston Vance," Diane said, tapping the society page where a glossy photograph showed a broad-shouldered young man in a tailored coat standing in front of a new luxury condo development downtown. "Vance Holdings breaks ground on Waterfront Tower," printed beneath in bold type. "Do you understand what this means, Emily? His father owns half of downtown. Half. And he has been asking Linda Hobbs about you. Asking. Mom, I have to go to work." Emily grabbed a granola bar from the counter, already reaching for her coat. "You are 26 years old." Diane followed her toward the door, robe fluttering voice, climbing the particular register it always climbed to when she felt Emily's future slipping out of her hands. 26. "Your father left us with nothing but debt and a life insurance policy that didn't cover the funeral, and I watched what that did to us. I watched it. I will not watch you do the same thing to yourself, out of some romantic idea that love is supposed to be hard. I'm not dating anyone, Mom. I don't even know Preston Vance. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to. Linda's setting up a dinner. Friday." Diane's eyes were bright, fierce, frightened in a way she would never admit to. "Just show up looking beautiful, and let the man fall in love with you. That's all I'm asking." Emily paused at the door, her hand on the cold brass knob, and looked back at her mother, at the tired lines around her eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with 12 years of stretching a diner and secretarial paycheck across two people's needs, at the particular brand of fear that masqueraded in her mother's voice as ambition. "Okay," she said finally, because some fights weren't worth having before 7 in the morning, and because some small guilty part of her understood exactly what her mother was afraid of. "Friday. I'll go to dinner." Diane's whole face changed, lit up like a switch had been thrown. "That's my girl." That evening, walking home in the blue dark with her collar turned up against the wind, Emily found herself glancing toward the alley by the hardware store before she'd even consciously decided to look. Grant was there again, same spot, same posture, a paperback novel with a cracked spine open on his knee, though the light was nearly gone. "You're still reading Steinbeck in the dark," she said, amused, despite herself. "Force of habit." He closed the book, marking his place with one finger. "I used to read a lot. Before." "Before what?" Something crossed his face, that same flicker of hesitation she'd seen the first night, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer her, might hand her some piece of the story he'd been carrying alone through 3 weeks of Anchorage winter. Instead, he looked down at the book, at his own chapped hands, and said only, "Before things got complicated." She didn't push. She sat down instead, right there on the cold sidewalk beside him, ignoring the way the concrete bit through her jeans, ignoring the strange look a passing couple gave them both, and pulled 2 coffees from the paper bag she was carrying, handing him one. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "But you don't have to be alone out here either. Not tonight." Grant Sorensen, billionaire architect of an empire built on the very silence he had never learned to break, looked at this stranger sitting beside him on a frozen sidewalk, giving away warmth she could not really afford to spare, and felt something inside his chest crack open just slightly. Not enough to let the whole truth out, not yet, but enough that for the first time in 21 days the cold did not feel quite so absolute. "Thank you, Emily," he said quietly, and meant it more than she would ever know. 3 months later, The dressing room at the Hotel Captain Cook smelled of lilies and hairspray, and the faint, sharp bite of nerves. Emily stood in front of the full-length mirror while her mother fussed with the last few pins in her veil, and from the hallway outside, muffled but unmistakable, came the sound of Preston Vance's voice, too loud, too pleased with itself, talking to someone Emily didn't recognize. "Relax, man. It's not like she's got anything I actually need anymore." A low laugh followed, careless, the kind of laugh a man gives when he thinks no one who matters can hear him. "Girl like that, you say the right things for a few months. You get access to what you need, and then hey, weddings fall through all the time, right? Cold feet. Happens to the best of us." Emily froze, one hand still raised to her veil, watching her own face go pale in the mirror. "Preston, honey, get away from the door," came a second voice, his mother, Carol Vance, sharp and amused. "You'll ruin the surprise." Diane Carter, standing just behind her daughter with a bobby pin still pinched between two fingers, had gone very still as well. "Emily, sweetheart, that's just wedding jitters. Men say stupid things when they're nervous." But Emily had heard the particular shape of that laugh before. She had heard it the night Preston had asked her almost offhandedly to move the last of her savings, the $11,400 her father had left her, every cent of it sitting untouched in a credit union account for 6 years, into a joint investment fund he swore would triple by the time they got back from their honeymoon. She had heard it in the small, dismissive way. He talked about her job at the processing plant, like it was something to be quietly phased out once they were married, like she was something to be quietly phased out, folded into the Vance family the way a company absorbs a smaller, less important asset. She told herself she was imagining things. She let her mother finish pinning the veil. The ballroom, when the doors finally opened 3 hours later, looked like something out of a magazine, white peonies cascading down the aisle, a string quartet playing something soft and expensive, 200 guests in their finest clothes, turning as one to watch her walk toward the altar on the arm of her Uncle Ray because there had been no father left to give her away. Preston was not standing at the altar. At first, the room read it as nerves, a groom's last-minute jitters, the kind of thing people laugh about at anniversary dinners for years afterward. The officiant checked his watch with an easy, professional smile. The quartet, uncertain, began the song again from the top. Emily stood at the head of the aisle in her mother's altered gown bouquet trembling faintly in her hands, and watched 200 faces slowly shift from polite anticipation into something else, something colder, more curious, the particular hunger of a crowd that senses correctly that it is about to witness a catastrophe. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became 40. It was Carol Vance who finally crossed the room, her heels sharp against the parquet floor, her face arranged into an expression of theatrical concern that did not reach her eyes. She held her phone out, screen glowing, a single text message displayed for the whole gathering to see, because some cruelties are only complete when they have an audience. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her it's business, not personal. The Anchorage account's already emptied, closing on the Seward property by Friday. Good luck, Em." The room did not gasp so much as exhale all at once, a great collective intake of scandal. "He's gone," Carol said, and there was something underneath her carefully composed sympathy that sounded almost satisfied, as though this outcome confirmed something she had believed about Emily Carter from the very beginning. "I'm so sorry, dear. Truly." Preston can be impulsive. Emily stood very still in the center of the ballroom floor, the bouquet trembling harder now, her ears filling with a high, thin, ringing sound that drowned out whatever the officiant was saying, whatever her mother was saying, whatever 200 strangers in their good clothes were murmuring behind. Raised hands. $11,400. Gone. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Gone. Wired out of an account she could no longer access, taken by a man who had, by his own admission, said the right things for exactly as long as it took to get what he needed. "Oh my God." A voice near the back not bothering to lower itself. "This is unbelievable. Poor thing. I heard he never even meant to marry her. Just needed access to something. Some property her father left, I think. Well, you know what they say. You reap what you sow, marrying up like that." Each sentence landed like a small, precise blow. Emily felt her mother's hand close hard around her wrist, heard Diane's voice, brittle and too bright, trying to salvage something. "We'll figure this out, sweetheart. Come sit down." But the words seemed to be arriving from very far, away, through water, through static. She looked at the sea of faces. She recognized almost none of them as friends. They were Vance family associates, business partners, the particular Anchorage elite that had spent 6 months quietly deciding whether Emily Carter, diner, regular daughter of a dead fisherman, was good enough to marry into their world, and had apparently this very evening arrived at their answer. "I need air," she said. and her voice came out strange and distant, even to her own ears. She did not wait for permission. She turned, gathering the heavy skirt of her gown in both fists, and walked, then ran down the long central aisle between the white peonies, past her mother's outstretched hand, past Uncle Ray's startled face, out through the tall, double doors of the Hotel Captain Cook, and into the biting, merciless cold of an Anchorage evening in her wedding dress veil, streaming out behind her like something torn loose in a storm. Behind her, the ballroom erupted into the particular chaos that follows a scandal, voices, rising phones, lifting Carol Vance, already composing with visible relish the story she would tell at brunch tomorrow. None of it followed Emily out into the street. Out there, the cold swallowed everything: sound, humiliation, the last $11,400 of her father's memory, until there was nothing left but her own ragged breathing and the click of her heels against frozen pavement. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not go back inside, could not sit through one more sympathetic murmur, one more calculated glance from Carol Vance's circle of friends, one more second of being the punchline in a story that was not in the end really about her at all. It had never been about her. It had been about an account number and a piece of Seward real estate, and how long a man was willing to pretend. 3 blocks from the hotel, her lungs burning, her satin shoes soaked through with slush, Emily stopped running. And there, huddled against the brick wall of a shuttered hardware store, exactly where she had left him 3 months of evenings ago, was Grant. He looked up at the sound of her ragged breathing, and whatever he saw in her face, the torn veil, the tear-streaked mascara, the particular hollow look of a woman who has just watched every promise made to her dissolve in real time, made him rise immediately to his feet, forgetting for one unguarded moment every careful rule he had set for himself these last 3 months. Emily. His voice cracked slightly on her name. What happened? She stood in front of him, shaking from cold, from shock, from something deeper and more dangerous than either, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, only stared at him with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. Not quite grief, not quite fury, but something entirely new, being born in real time right there on the frozen sidewalk, out of the wreckage of everything she'd believed about love and money, and the men willing to lie about both. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind cut down the empty street between them, snatching at the torn edge of Emily's veil, and somewhere behind her, 3 blocks back, the lit windows of the Hotel Captain Cook glowed warm and gold and utterly unbearably false. "They're still in there," Emily said finally, and her voice had a strange, flat quality to it, like something had come loose inside her and not yet settled back into place. 200 people, laughing, probably still laughing right now. Emily. Grant took a careful step closer, the way a man approaches something wounded and unpredictable. "Tell me what happened." "He's gone." A short, brittle laugh escaped her, nothing like her real laugh. Nothing like the sound she'd made 3 months ago, telling him Mrs. Kowalski made meatloaf better than anybody had a right to. "Preston's gone. Took every cent my father left me and disappeared, and everyone in that room already knew before I did. They were waiting for it, waiting to watch it happen to me." Grant felt something ignite low in his chest, a slow-burning anger he had no right to feel and could not in that moment extinguish. He knew men like Preston Vance. He had spent a career learning to recognize them across a boardroom table, the practiced warmth, the careful cultivation of trust as a tool rather than a virtue. He said nothing about any of that. It was not his place, not yet, and some instinct told him this was not a moment for anger, however justified. It was a moment for standing still and letting someone fall apart without flinching away from it. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "That's not fair. None of that is fair." "Fair." Emily wiped at her face with the back of one shaking hand, smearing mascara across her cheekbone. "Do you know what my mother's going to say? She's going to say I should have married Preston sooner, before he had the chance to change his mind. She's going to say I let this happen. She's been telling me my whole life that love doesn't pay the electric bill, and tonight she's going to be right, and I don't think I can stand there and listen to her be right one more time." She was shaking harder now, and Grant realized with a small jolt of alarm that it was not only grief. The temperature had dropped several degrees in the last hour, and she was standing on a public sidewalk in a satin wedding gown with no coat, no gloves, her breath coming in visible ragged clouds. "You're freezing," he said. "Come on. There's a bus shelter." "No." She said it with sudden, startling force, gripping the sleeve of his threadbare coat like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "No, I'm not. I can't go back there. I can't walk back into that ballroom and let them see me come back defeated. I won't. Nobody's asking you to go back. They are, though." Her eyes, when she lifted them to his, were bright and wild and something close to reckless. That's exactly what they're expecting. Poor Emily Carter crying in the parking lot, coming back inside for her mother's sake, sitting through the rest of the reception with her ruined dress and her empty bank account, letting Carol Vance pat her hand and call her brave. She laughed again, that same brittle, unfamiliar sound. I would rather die than give them that. Grant said nothing. He had learned in 21 days and then some the particular value of silence, of simply staying present in a moment too large for words, letting someone talk their way toward whatever truth they were circling. And then Emily's grip on his sleeve changed, tightened. Her eyes, still wet, sharpened into something with a plan behind it. Come with me, she said. Emily, I mean it. She was already pulling him toward the direction of the hotel, her torn veil streaming out behind her, her wrecked mascara catching the streetlight like something almost fierce. You said nobody's asking me to go back defeated. Fine. Then I won't go back defeated. I'll go back on my own terms. What are you talking about? She stopped, turning to face him fully, and for one long moment she simply looked at him, really looked the way she had looked at him that first snowy evening outside Kowalski's, except now there was something desperate mixed in with the kindness, something born entirely out of the wreckage of the last hour. You've been sitting on that sidewalk for 3 months. Every single day, no matter how cold, no matter how people looked at you. You never once complained. You never once asked me for anything but a little company. Her voice cracked. You are the only person in this entire city who has never lied to me, Grant. Not once. Do you understand what that's worth to me tonight? Grant's chest tightened with a feeling he could not immediately name, something between panic and a strange, disbelieving warmth. Emily, whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking. I have a ballroom full of people waiting to watch me fall apart, she said, and I would rather give them something they never saw coming. He tried twice to slow her down, to make her stop and think this through in the cold, clear light of an ordinary evening rather than the wreckage of the worst night of her life. But Emily Carter had already made up her mind, and there was a particular unbending quality to her now that he recognized, somewhere deep down from the version of himself that had once walked away from a penthouse and a boardroom to sit on a sidewalk in the snow. The doors of the Hotel Captain Cook swung open, and Emily walked back into the ballroom. Veil, torn mascara, streaked satin hem, soaked black with slush, with Grant in his threadbare second-hand coat, and mismatched boots walking directly beside. Unhea. The room went silent, the way a room goes silent, only once, all conversation dying mid-sentence. 200 faces turning in perfect, horrified unison. Carol Vance's hand froze halfway to her champagne glass. Diane Carter rose halfway out of her seat, one hand pressed flat against her chest, as though trying to hold her own heart in place. Emily. Her mother's started voice climbing toward panic. Emily, sweetheart, who is this? This is Grant, Emily said, and her voice, though it trembled, carried clean across the stunned ballroom. And since apparently we're all here anyway, dressed up, flowers paid for, minister still on the clock, she turned, searching out the officiant who stood frozen near the altar with his book still open in his hands. I would like to get married tonight. To him. A ripple went through the crowd, gasps, a scattering of disbelieving laughter. Someone near the back saying too loudly, is this a joke? Someone else already lifting a phone to film it. Emily, have you lost your mind? Diane's voice cracked down the middle, humiliation and terror braided together. That man is homeless. You don't even know him. I know him better than I knew Preston, Emily said, and something in the flat, exhausted certainty of her voice silenced even her mother for a moment. I know he's never once lied to me. That's more than I can say for anyone else standing in this room tonight. Grant stood frozen beside her, every carefully constructed plan of the last 3 months collapsing at once. 21. Now nearly 100 days of anonymity balanced on the single impossible edge of this moment. He could stop this. One sentence. My name is Grant Sorensen. I own 11 processing plants. This is not what you think it is. And the whole absurd, beautiful, terrifying scene would dissolve into something explicable, manageable, safe. He said nothing, because looking at Emily Carter standing in the wreckage of her own wedding day, offering the last of her dignity to a stranger in a torn coat rather than one more moment of pity from people who had never once been kind to her, Grant understood with a clarity that frightened him more than any boardroom collapse ever had that he did not want to be rescued from this moment. He wanted to know what happened next. Yes, he heard himself say quietly into the stunned silence of the ballroom. I'll marry you, Emily. The room erupted. Gasps, laughter, someone's champagne glass shattering on the parquet floor, and somewhere in the chaos, Carol Vance's voice rose above it all, sharp, with disbelieving delight already composing the story she would tell, for years to come. You will not believe what that Carter girl did tonight. Neither Grant nor Emily heard her. They were looking only at each other. two people standing at the exact center of a catastrophe. Neither of them had planned each privately, wondering for entirely different reasons what on earth they had just done. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Emily saw it first on her phone propped against the window of the studio apartment she had until that morning, shared officially with no one. 31 seconds of shaky cell phone footage, already shared 4,000 times, titled, by whoever had first posted it, Anchorage Bride Marries. Homeless man after groom skips out, you won't believe this. In the comments, strangers she would never meet had already decided everything about her. Gold digger in reverse. Desperate. Somebody call a wellness check on this girl. She set the phone face down on the counter and did not pick it up again for the rest of the day. Grant sat across from her at the small kitchen table, still in the same threadbare coat, watching her with a careful, searching expression, as if trying to gauge how much of the previous night's certainty had survived the cold light of the morning. You don't have to stay, he said quietly. There's still time to have this undone. Annulled. Nobody would blame you. I know. Emily wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. I'm not undoing it. Emily, I said what I meant last night. Her voice was steady, though her eyes, when they met his, carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had slept perhaps 2 hours. I'm not taking it back just because it's inconvenient this morning. Whatever Grant might have said next was interrupted by the sound of the apartment buzzer, harsh and insistent, followed a moment later by a fist pounding against the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Emily Rose Carter, open this door right now. Diane Carter stood in the hallway when Emily opened it, still in yesterday's dress. Her mascara long since cried away, her face gray with something that looked less like anger now and more like genuine grief. Behind her, arms crossed, stood Emily's older sister Kayla, wearing an expression that suggested she had come not to comfort but to gloat. Do you have any idea? Diane said, stepping past her daughter into the small apartment without being asked what you have done to this family. Do you understand what people are saying about us right now? I had 3 calls this morning canceling. Committee positions. Committee positions, Emily. 15 years I built a reputation in this town and you tore it down in one night over a man who sleeps behind a hardware store. His name is Grant, Emily said quietly. I don't care what his name is. Diane's voice cracked upward, echoing off the apartment's bare walls. You had a chance at a real life. A house. Security. Everything I never had after your father died and left us with nothing but his boat payments and a stack of unpaid bills. And you threw it away out of some ridiculous romantic fit of pride because you were embarrassed in front of people who were never going to think well of you anyway. Preston stole my savings, Mom. Emily's voice was low, careful, holding itself together by visible effort. Every cent Dad left me. He was never going to marry me. He said it himself on tape, before he even left the building. And you think this is the answer? Diane gestured wildly toward Grant, who stood silent and still by the kitchen window, absorbing the insult without visible reaction, the way he had learned over 3 months on the street to absorb almost anything. A man with nothing. A man who can't even afford a coat that fits. You've traded one disaster for another, and this one you can't undo with a good lawyer because you married him, Emily. In front of 200 witnesses. Kayla, who had said nothing until now, finally spoke, her voice sweet and cutting in the particular way that only a sister's cruelty can be. I always said you had a martyr complex. Guess I was right. Get out, Emily said, and though her voice shook, it did not waver. Both of you. Get out of my apartment. Diane stood frozen for a long moment, staring at her daughter as though seeing a stranger, and something in her face beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, cracked open just slightly into something closer to fear. You will regret this, she said, finally, quieter now. I hope to God you don't, Emily. But you will. The door closed behind them with a sound that seemed in the small apartment unnaturally loud. Later that afternoon, a black pickup truck pulled up outside the building, and a man climbed out who moved with the particular alertness of someone perpetually bracing for a problem to solve. Walt Higgins had known Grant Sorensen for nearly 30 years, since the two of them were boys running wild along the Sorensen family's dock, since long before either of them had any real idea what money could do to a person or take from them. He had been the best man at a wedding that never should have happened the first time. Grant's brief, disastrous first marriage years ago to a woman who had wanted the yacht more than the man, and he had sworn quietly to himself that he would never again stand by and watch his oldest friend have his heart to someone without asking a single hard question first. He found Grant alone on the apartment's narrow back stairwell, staring out at the gray sweep of the inlet, looking for the first time in longer than Walt could remember, genuinely uncertain of himself. You want to explain to me, Walt said, leaning against the railing. How in the span of about 6 hours you went from sleeping behind a hardware store to legally married to a woman you've known for 3 months. It's not that simple. Walt. No, actually it's exactly that simple, and that's what scares me. Walt's voice, though rough with concern, carried none of Diane Carter's cruelty. None of a blunt protective worry of an old friend who had watched Grant get hurt before and did not intend to watch it happen twice. Grant, I love you like a brother, but think about what you're describing. A woman gets humiliated at her own wedding, loses her savings to a con artist, and within the hour marries a total stranger off the street in front of 200 witnesses. You don't think that's convenient? You don't think a woman that desperate might see exactly what you're worth the second the truth comes out? She doesn't know who I am. Not yet. Walt's jaw tightened. But it's a matter of time before somebody recognizes you, or before this whole thing ends up on the news for real. And then what? You think she married a homeless man out of the goodness of her heart, or you think some part of her is smart enough to bet that a man who carries himself the way you do, who reads Steinbeck and talks like he went to a private school, isn't exactly what he appears to be. Grant said nothing for a long moment, watching a fishing trawler cut a slow white line across the gray water below. I don't think that's what this is, he said finally. You don't think it is? Walt shook his head, exhaling hard, the plume of his breath vanishing into the cold. Grant, 3 weeks ago you told me you needed to disappear because you couldn't tell anymore who actually cared about you and who just cared about the company. Now you're telling me the solution was to marry a stranger in the middle of the worst night of her life. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to keep you from waking up in 6 months finding out the hard way that some people are very, very good at looking exactly like what you're searching for. And if she's not one of them, Grant turned to face his old friend fully for the first time, something raw and unguarded showing through the careful stillness he'd maintained for weeks. If she's exactly what she looks like, Walt, if she's the one person in this entire city who would still choose me, even believing I have nothing, don't I owe it to myself to find out? Walt studied him for a long moment, the wind pulling at both their collars, and though the worry did not leave his face, something in his voice softened just slightly when he spoke again. Just be careful, he said. That's all I'm asking. Let me watch her. Quietly. If she's real, you'll never even know I was there. And if she's not, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Grant nodded once, slow and reluctant, and turned back toward the gray water, toward the small apartment above the laundromat, where a woman he barely knew was at that very moment hanging her ruined wedding dress in the back of a closet, could not yet afford to fill with anything better, unaware that, somewhere below her window, the oldest friend her new husband had in the world had just quietly begun the process of deciding whether to trust her or to tear the whole fragile, impossible thing apart before it had the chance to become real. That night, long after Emily had fallen asleep on the apartment's narrow pull-out couch, Grant sat alone at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning low, turning a small cracked photograph over and over between his fingers the way he had done 1,000 times before in 1,000 different rooms across more than 20 years. The photograph had faded to the color of weak tea. In it, a woman with dark hair and Grant's same pale gray eyes stood on the deck of a fishing boat, laughing at something outside the frame, one hand shading her eyes against a sun that no longer existed in any calendar Grant could name. He did not need the photograph to remember her face. He needed it instead. The way a man needs an anchor, something solid to hold on to, so the memory did not simply dissolve into the same fog that had swallowed the rest of that year. He had been 12 years old. His father, Michael Sorensen, had built a small fleet from nothing, 3 boats, a modest processing shed on the edge of Ship Creek, a name that meant something to the handful of families who worked the docks alongside him. It was not wealth, not by the standards Grant would come to know later, but it was enough. Enough for a house with a yard. Enough for his mother Sarah to hum while she hung laundry on a line strung between 2 spruce trees. Enough for Sunday dinners that stretched late into summer evenings, while his father told stories about the season's catch, exaggerating the size of every halibut by another 10 pounds each time he told it. Then over the span of a single terrible month it had all come apart. Grant did not fully understand it at 12, and even now at nearly 40 entire sections of that month remained blurred, half-formed like a photograph developed wrong. He remembered his father coming home late night after night, his face gray under the porch light, speaking in a low-clipped voice to men. Grant did not recognize men in suits that did not belong on the docks, men whose cars did not belong in the gravel driveway. He remembered raised voices behind a closed bedroom door, his mother's voice sharp and frightened in a way he had never heard before, and a single sentence that had lodged itself permanently in some deep, unreachable part of him. "You don't understand what he's capable of, Michael. You don't understand what he'll do to us." He remembered a stranger's car parked outside the house, one rain-soaked evening, a tall man in a dark coat standing at the end of the driveway, just long enough for Grant watching from an upstairs window to see his mother go out to meet him, her arms wrapped tight around herself against the cold. He remembered the shape of their argument through the glass, though not the words. He remembered his mother's shoulders shaking, and he remembered waking up the next morning to a house that had gone completely permanently silent. His mother was gone. Not gone the way people are gone when they step out for the morning, gone the way a lamp goes out without warning, without ceremony, leaving only the sudden disorienting dark. His father had told him in a voice that did not invite a single follow-up question that Sarah had left, that she was not coming back, and that Grant was not to ask about it again. Within the year, the boats were gone, 2 sold off one by one to cover debts Grant as a child. He had no framework to understand, and the family that had once eaten Sunday dinners on the deck of a fishing boat had shrunk down to 2 grieving, silent people in a smaller and smaller series of rented rooms, until his father's heart, worn down by something Grant would only years later learn to call grief, finally gave out on a gray October morning. Grant had grown into manhood carrying a single unspoken belief hard as stone at the center of him, that when the money disappeared, his mother had chosen to disappear along with it. That whatever love she'd shown him across those first 12 years had in the end weighed less in the balance than comfort, than ease, than a life that did not require standing beside a man whose fortunes had collapsed. He had never said this belief out loud to another living person. He had built instead an entire empire on top of it, as if enough zeros at the end of a bank statement might finally answer the question. His mother's silence had left open for over 2 decades. Was I not worth staying for? Only Walt knew any part of the story, and even Walt did not know all of it. They had been boys together on the same stretch of docks, and Walt had been there in the wreckage of that year, close enough to witness the outline of Grant's grief, even if he had never been let all the way inside it. "You still carry that thing around," Walt had said once years ago, nodding at the photograph tucked into Grant's wallet during a late night at the office back when the company was young and neither of them slept much. "Your mom." Abbott Grant had said the same word he'd used with Emily, the same small, insufficient word he reached for every time the subject threatened to open further than he could bear. Walt had not pushed then. He rarely did. But there had always been something in the careful, watchful way Walt guarded Grant's trust. Something Grant understood now. Sitting alone in Emily's small kitchen with the photograph warm from his own hands came directly from having watched up close exactly what it cost a person to be let down by someone they loved beyond reason. Walt's caution was not cruelty. It was in its own clumsy way. A kind of protection Grant had never quite known how to accept gracefully. He looked toward the couch where Emily slept, curled beneath a thin blanket, one arm tucked under her cheek, her face finally mercifully unguarded in sleep, after a day spent absorbing her mother's fury and her sister's contempt. Without once flinching, she had not asked him a single question about his past tonight. She had simply made him a cup of tea. He hadn't finished, told him he didn't have to explain anything. He wasn't ready to explain, and gone to sleep trusting that whatever he was carrying, he would set it down in his own time. It occurred to him, watching her breathe in the low lamplight, that this exact quality of patience offered without condition, without an invoice attached, was precisely the thing his 12-year-old self had spent 20 years, convinced did not exist in the world. He had built glass towers and fishing fleets and boardrooms full of careful transactional relationships, trying to prove himself worthy of a love his mother had apparently decided he was not worth staying for. And here, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, was a woman who had given him a plate of meatloaf on a freezing sidewalk, without once asking what he could offer in return. He did not know, sitting there in the dark with his mother's faded photograph, that the truth of what had actually happened, that rain-soaked night, a truth buried for over 20 years beneath threats, silence, and one man's careful, ruthless money, was closer to him than it had ever been, waiting only for someone brave enough or desperate enough or loving enough to finally go looking for it. He slid the photograph back into his coat pocket over his heart the way he always did, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself quietly in the dark to wonder whether the answer he had spent his whole life running from might not be the one he had assumed it was. Outside, the wind off the inlet had finally begun to still, and somewhere out past the harbor lights the tide was turning. The following week, Walt Higgins parked his truck across the street from the laundromat, with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in the console, and a legal pad on the passenger seat, 3 lines of notes scrawled across the top in his blocky, impatient handwriting. He had told himself this was reconnaissance, nothing more, nothing personal, just a favor for an old friend who could not at the moment be trusted to see clearly where his own heart was concerned. He had not told Grant he was doing it. He told himself that omission too was for Grant's own good. He watched Emily leave for work a little after 6 that morning, hair still damp from the shower, a granola bar clenched between her teeth while she wrestled her coat on one arm at a time, and he watched her come home again 9.5 hours later looking like a woman who had spent the whole day being quietly humiliated by everyone around her, which, as Walt would learn over the following days, was more or less exactly what had happened. The processing plant had not fired her outright. That would have been too obvious, too easy to point to. Instead, her supervisor, a heavy-set man named Derek Holloway, who had clearly seen the video along with everyone else in Anchorage, had begun scheduling her for the coldest, wettest shifts on the loading dock, had started leaving her name off. The sign-up sheet for overtime had taken to making comments just loud enough to be heard, just careful enough to never quite cross into anything a human resources complaint could catch about employees who brought unnecessary drama into a professional workplace. Walt watched Emily walk the 4 blocks home in the sleet on a Tuesday evening, soaked through shoulders, hunched, and he expected, almost hoped in the ungenerous part of himself still bracing for confirmation of his suspicions, that she would come home and complain or cry or call her mother and ask for help extracting herself from the mess she'd made. Instead, she stopped at Kowalski's diner on the way exactly as she always had and came out 5 minutes later with 2 foil-wrapped bundles instead of 1. Walt frowned, sitting up a little in his seat, and followed on foot the rest of the way, staying half a block behind, close enough to watch through the apartment's thin curtains, as Emily handed one of the bundles to Grant, still not registering apparently that Grant Sorensen no longer needed anyone to feed him, that he could have bought the entire diner outright without noticing the expense, and sat down across from him at the small kitchen table to eat the other half herself, the two of them talking quietly, unhurried, like two people with nowhere better to be. Walt made a note on his legal pad. Still bringing food day 9. He was not yet sure what conclusion the note was building toward. A few days later, Walt got his answer, though not in the way he expected. He had let himself into the apartment building's stairwell, under the pretense of checking a leaking pipe he'd mentioned to the landlord, a small, unnecessary lie that had become, over the past week, a habit he was not proud of. From the landing outside the apartment door, left slightly ajar against the June heat, he heard Grant's voice, thin and unsteady, in a way Walt had rarely heard from his old friend. "I think I'm coming down with something," Grant was saying. "Don't worry about it, I'll be fine by morning. You're burning up." Emily's voice sharp with concern. "Grant, you're shaking." Walt understood with a small guilty jolt exactly what he was watching unfold. Grant had manufactured the illness, a mild fever, deliberately underdressed on a cold walk, 2 days prior, the oldest trick in a very particular kind of playbook, as one final careful test. Walt had seen him do something similar once before, years ago, with a business partner he'd suspected of insincerity, create a moment of apparent weakness, and watch, with cold clinical precision, exactly how the other person responded when there was nothing obvious to be gained by responding well. Walt should have felt satisfied watching the plan play out. Instead, standing frozen in the stairwell, he felt something closer to shame. Because Emily did not hesitate, did not weigh the inconvenience, did not so much as glance toward whatever advantage she might extract from tending to a sick husband with no money and no prospects. She simply moved, pulling a spare blanket from the closet, filling a glass with water, pressing the back of her hand to Grant's forehead with the unthinking efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before for someone else at some earlier point in her life. "When my dad was sick," she said quietly, settling onto the edge of the pull-out couch beside him toward the end. "Mom couldn't always be there, working double shifts to cover the medical bills. So I learned. You put a cool cloth here." Walt heard the soft, damp sound of fabric against skin, "and you talk to them even if they're too out of it to really answer. My dad used to say the worst part of being sick wasn't the fever. It was feeling like you'd become invisible to everybody around you, like you were already halfway gone before you actually were." There was a long silence. When Grant spoke again, his voice had lost some of its performed unsteadiness, replaced by something quieter, more genuinely unguarded than Walt had heard from him in years. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man." A small, sad laugh. "Not a rich one, but good. I think about him every time I catch myself wanting things I can't afford, like I can still hear him telling me the electric bill doesn't care how much you loved somebody." A pause. "I don't regret marrying you, Grant. Even with everything my mother's said. Even with people I've known my whole life crossing the street so they don't have to say hello to me anymore. I don't regret it." Why not? Grant's voice, genuinely curious, now stripped of any remaining performance. You could have everything you wanted. A house, security, everything your mother's always wanted for you. And instead you're sitting on a pull-out couch nursing a man who owns nothing. Because you never once asked me for anything, Emily said simply. Not one single time. Preston asked me for everything, my savings, my time, eventually, probably my whole life folded up neatly into whatever shape worked best for him. You've never asked me for a single thing except company. I don't know how to explain what that's worth to somebody who grew up the way I did, watching my mother count every dollar twice before she'd let herself spend it. It's not about the money, Grant. It never was. It's about not being used. Out in the stairwell, Walt Higgins stood very still, his legal pad hanging forgotten at his side, and felt the careful architecture of his suspicion begin quietly and irreversibly to crumble. He thought of the notes he'd taken over the past 9 days, still bringing food, stayed late at diner without being asked, gave up her only day off to walk him to the free clinic when she thought he had a cough, and understood standing there in the humid stairwell with his own coffee, gone cold too. Flights below that he had spent over a week searching for evidence of a con that did not exist, because it was easier somehow to distrust a stranger than to accept that his oldest friend might, and against every hard-won instinct either of them had ever developed, have actually found something real. He did not go inside. He was not ready yet to admit out loud how wrong he had been. But he left the building that evening without writing a single further note on the legal pad, and for the first time since Emily Carter had dragged a homeless stranger into a wedding hall full of humiliated guests, Walt Higgins found himself, hoping quietly, reluctantly, against every defensive habit. 30 years of protecting Grant Sorensen had built into him that she was exactly who she appeared to be. Because if she was, he thought, walking back to his truck through the thinning evening light, then his oldest friend might finally, after 2 decades of silence, have found the one thing all his money had never managed to buy him. 10 days later, the letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a water bill and a flyer for a carpet cleaning service, and Emily almost threw it away without reading it. A plain white envelope from Pacific Rim Seafood Processing, the return address stamped in the same cold corporate typeface that had signed her last 3 years of paychecks. She read it standing in the hallway, still in her coat, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. Due to recent reorganization of the loading operations division, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. 2-week severance will be provided per company policy. There was no mention of the wedding video. There didn't need to be. Everyone at the plant had watched it, had watched Derek Holloway's campaign of small, deniable cruelties over the past 3 weeks, and everyone understood, without a single word being spoken aloud, exactly what reorganization meant. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the last month to last a lifetime, she told herself, folding the letter carefully back along its original creases and setting it on the counter beside the mail she hadn't opened yet. Instead, she sat down at the small kitchen table, pulled out the battered spiral notebook she used for grocery lists, and began methodically to add up exactly how many weeks $280 in severance and the last of her savings might stretch. Grant found her there an hour later, the notebook covered in small, careful columns of numbers. Her jaw set in the particular way he had already learned, meant she was holding herself together through sheer will. "They let you go," he said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled fast in a city the size of Anchorage, especially when the story involved a viral wedding video and a company eager to distance itself from the scandal. "Reorganization," Emily said flatly, not looking up from her columns. "That's what the letter called it." Grant sat down across from her, and for a long moment he said nothing, watching her add and re-add the same set of numbers as though a different total might appear if she tried hard enough. He thought not for the first time of how easily he could end this one phone call to his accountant, one transfer that would mean nothing to his own balance sheet and everything to hers. He had promised himself at the start of all this that he would not use his money to solve problems. That money alone could not actually fix, that the entire point of the last 3 months had been to find out what a person's character looked like when there was nothing to gain from it. But watching Emily's hand tighten around her pencil, watching her do the quiet arithmetic of survival at a kitchen table that had never once been generous to her, he understood with sudden clarity that there was a difference between rescuing someone and simply refusing to stand by while they drowned. "I have an idea," he said carefully. "It's small, but I think it could work." The following Saturday, they walked down to the small covered dock at the edge of the harbor together, where a handful of vendors set up folding tables on weekend mornings to sell smoked salmon, halibut cheeks, and jars of homemade cranberry, relish to the tourists still trickling through before the couple. season fully closed. Grant had spent years of his life around docks like this one, had grown up on them. In fact, though he had not told Emily that part yet, and he knew, in a way that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with instinct, exactly what a small, honest stall selling fresh-caught fish needed to survive its first season. Emily used the last of her severance, and what remained of the money she'd managed to keep separate from Preston's reach, $600 in total, every cent of it hard-won, to rent a folding table, a second-hand cooler, and hand-lettered sign that read simply, Carter's. Catch fresh daily. It's not much, she said that first morning, arranging fillets on a bed of ice with hands that had gone red and stiff in the cold. But it's something. It's mine. It's more than something, Grant said, and meant it in a way she could not yet fully understand. He worked beside her at the folding table through those first cold weekends, hauling ice, filleting fish with a precision that occasionally made Emily glance at him sideways. You're better at this than you let on for a man who claimed he's never held a real job, and he found himself for the real job. First time in over 20 years doing work with his own two hands instead of directing it from behind a glass office wall. His fingers ached by the end of each Saturday in a way that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with honest labor, and something about that particular ache felt absurdly like relief. Word traveled slowly at first, then not so slowly. A regular customer told a friend. The friend told a food blogger who wrote briefly kindly about a small new stall run by a hard-working young woman rebuilding after a rough year and her quiet, capable husband. Within a month, Carter's Catch had a small, loyal following enough that Emily began coming home some evenings, not with a spiral notebook full of subtraction, but with one tentatively full of addition. Walt watched all of this from a comfortable distance, now no longer hiding in stairwells with a legal pad, but simply stopping by most Saturdays with a thermos of coffee, and increasingly an extra pair of hands. He had said nothing to Grant about the shift in his own suspicions, some part of him still too proud or too embarrassed to admit outright how thoroughly he had been wrong, but he showed up anyway week after week, hauling ice and untangling fishing line, and, one particularly cold Saturday, quietly slipping a $20 bill into Emily's tip jar when he thought no one was looking. You didn't have to do that, Emily said, catching him. Didn't do anything, Walt said gruffly, already turning back toward the cooler. Must have fallen out of my pocket. Emily smiled, and let him have the lie the way people do when kindness is easier to accept sideways than face on. That evening, walking back from the dock with the cooler between them, Grant caught Walt's eye over Emily's head, and gave him a small questioning look. Well, and Walt, after a long moment, only shrugged, though something had visibly softened in his weathered face over the past weeks. She's the real thing, Grant, he admitted finally, quietly, once Emily had gone ahead to unlock the apartment door. I hate that I doubted her. I really do. I was so busy protecting you from getting hurt again, I almost cost you the one person who might actually be worth the risk. Grant clapped a hand on his old friend's shoulder, something loosening in his own chest that had been wound tight for longer than even he had realized. You were trying to protect me. I can't fault you for that. Still. Walt shook his head, watching Emily disappear up the stairwell ahead of them, humming something under her breath, a woman who had lost nearly everything twice over in the space of a few months, and had somehow found a way to build something small and honest out of the wreckage each time. I've known you since we were kids throwing rocks off your dad's dock, Grant. I haven't seen you look at anybody the way you look at her. Not once. Not even before. Grant didn't answer right away. He was thinking instead of a girl on a snowy sidewalk 3 months earlier holding out a foil-wrapped plate of meatloaf to a stranger, with nothing to offer in return, and of how far that single small kindness had already carried them, both, and how much further he suspected standing at the edge of a truth he did not yet know was waiting to be uncovered. They still had left to go. 3 weeks later, Walt Higgins sat in his cramped home office long after midnight, a desk lamp throwing a small circle of yellow light across a spread of documents he had spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly assembling: court filings, old newspaper archives scanned from the Anchorage Daily News, microfiche at the public library, county property records that had taken 3 separate requests, and one uncomfortable conversation with a records clerk to finally produce. He had told himself at the outset that this was simply due diligence, a background check on Preston Vance that any reasonable person would have run before letting a con man anywhere near someone they cared about. He had not expected to find anything beyond confirmation of what everyone in Anchorage already suspected, that Preston Vance was a spoiled, careless man who had likely done this before somewhere to someone else. He had not expected to find his own oldest friend's family name buried 30 pages into a decades-old civil filing. Sorensen v. Vance Maritime Holdings, filed 26 years prior. Walt sat back slowly in his chair, the old case number blurring slightly before his tired eyes, and read the filing a second time, to be certain he hadn't misunderstood it. Michael Sorensen, Grant's father, had filed suit against a company called Vance Maritime Holdings 26 years earlier, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation in a joint fishing rights partnership that had, within the span of a single devastating season, stripped the small Sorensen fleet of its most lucrative harvest routes, and left Michael Sorensen holding debts he had never actually incurred. The case had been dismissed after only 4 months. Insufficient evidence, the filing noted, though Walt, reading between the clipped legal language, recognized the particular shape of a case that had simply run out of money to fight before it ever reached a courtroom. The company's registered agent listed on the very first page of the filing was a man named Harold Vance. Walt sat very still for a long moment, the old newspaper pages spread across his desk, suddenly rearranging themselves into a picture he had not been prepared to see. He pulled up the archived newspaper clippings, next brittle, grainy scans from a year he remembered only as a distant, half-formed unease from his own childhood, the year his best friend's family had simply quietly come apart. Local fishermen file suit against Maritime Holdings Company. One headline read, dated the spring Grant had turned 12. A smaller item 6 months later, buried on page 14, Sorensen Fisheries ceases operations, 3 vessels sold at auction. And then 8 months after that, an obituary. Michael Sorensen, 41, beloved father, longtime Anchorage fisherman, passed away suddenly. Walt had known Michael Sorensen's death was sudden. He had stood beside 12-year-old Grant at the funeral, had watched his best friend's face go carefully, permanently blank in a way that Walt, even at that age, understood was a wound too large to be spoken about out loud. He had never known, had never once been told in nearly 30 years of friendship, that there had been a lawsuit at all, let alone one connected to a company whose current chairman's son was this very year. The same man who had emptied Emily Carter's savings account and vanished the night before their wedding. Preston Vance. Walt pulled up the younger man's public records, with hands that were not entirely steady. Father Harold Vance, chairman and majority shareholder of Vance Holdings, the same real estate and maritime investment firm that had 26 years earlier operated under the name Vance Maritime Holdings, before rebranding sometime in the early 2000s to reflect its expansion into downtown development. It was not a coincidence. Walt had spent enough years around boardrooms, enough years protecting Grant from men exactly like this, to know that coincidences of this particular size simply did not occur, that somewhere buried under 2.5 decades of careful corporate rebranding and old court filings, sealed away in dusty archive boxes, there existed a direct line connecting the ruin of Michael Sorensen's small fishing fleet to the very family that had this year nearly destroyed the woman his best friend had married. He sat back in his chair, the desk lamp humming faintly, and felt the full weight of what he had found settle over him like cold water. Grant did not know. Walt was almost certain of that. Certain in the way you can only be certain about someone you have known since childhood. Certain from decades of watching Grant's face carefully avoid any subject connected to his father's 2-year certain that if Grant had known the Vance name was tied to his family's collapse, he would never, could never have simply walked past it in silence for 26 years. But there was a second possibility gnawing at the edge of Walt's certainty, one he could not quite dismiss no matter how many times he tried to reason his way past it. What if Grant did know? What if some part of the elaborate disguise, the disappearance the 3 weeks spent testing strangers on cold Anchorage sidewalks, had never really been about testing the goodness of the world at all? What if it had been, at least in part, about positioning himself close enough to a family he had spent 26 years quietly, patiently, waiting to confront? Walt thought of the particular stillness that came over Grant whenever the subject of his father arose, the careful, well-worn deflections habit he always said about the photograph, about everything, and wondered for the first time in their long friendship whether that stillness had been grief, alone, or something closer to a debt being kept meticulously on a ledger only Grant could see. He gathered the papers into a single folder, his hands steadier now with purpose than they had been with shock, and sat for a long time in the small circle of lamplight, weighing what he owed to whom. He owed Grant the truth that much was not in question, but he understood, turning the folder over once in his hands, that the truth he was about to deliver would not simply answer questions. It would open a much larger, much more dangerous one. Whether the man Walt had spent 30 years protecting had this entire time been protecting a much older, much colder plan of his own, one that might have used Emily Carter, however unintentionally, as nothing more than a convenient thread, leading back to the family that had once destroyed everything Grant Sorensen had ever loved. He picked up his phone, scrolled to Grant's number, and set it back down again without dialing. Not tonight, he decided. This conversation deserved daylight, and a clear head, and enough time to be certain of every word before he said it, because whatever answer Grant gave him tomorrow, Walt understood, standing at the window and watching the last lights of the harbor flicker against the black water, would either confirm that his oldest friend had finally found something real and worth protecting, or reveal that even Grant Sorensen, the most honest man Walt had ever known, was capable of building a truth around a much older, much more carefully guarded lie. The next morning, Walt arrived at the small apartment above the laundromat before Emily had left for the dock, the folder tucked under one arm, his jaw set in a way Grant recognized immediately as trouble. "We need to talk," Walt said. "Alone." Emily, sensing the weight in his voice, gathered her coat and the cooler, without being asked, and slipped out toward the harbor, telling Grant she'd hold down the stall until he caught up. The door closed behind her, and for a moment the small kitchen held nothing but the tick of the radiator and the sound of Walt setting the folder down on the table between them, like a man laying down a weapon he wasn't certain he wanted to use. 26 years ago, Walt said. Without preamble, your father filed a lawsuit against a company called Vance Maritime Holdings. Fraudulent misrepresentation. Stripped your family's fishing rights, buried you in debt that wasn't even yours to begin with. He slid the first document across the table. The registered agent on that company was a man named Harold Vance. Grant went very still, the color draining slowly from his face as he stared down at the old filing at his father's name, typed in cold legal font beside a company he had never once in 26 years heard mentioned in his own house. "That's not possible," Grant said quietly. "My father never talked about a lawsuit. He didn't get very far with it. Case was dismissed in 4 months, ran out of money before it ever saw a courtroom." Walt's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something searching Grant's face for a reaction he clearly wasn't certain he wanted to find. Harold Vance is Preston Vance's father, Grant. Same company, different name now. They rebranded into real estate about 20 years back. It's the same family. Grant picked up the document with hands that were not entirely steady, reading it once. Then again, as if a third reading might reveal it to be some elaborate mistake. "I didn't know this," he said, and his voice when it came carried a rawness Walt had rarely heard from him. "Walt, I swear to you I had no idea. I believe you." Walt's own voice cracked, slightly relief and guilt tangled together. "I do. But I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight, because it's been eating me alive since I found this last night." He leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "When you decided to disappear to walk out on the street and start this whole test, did you already know Preston Vance's name? Did you know who his family was before you ever sat down on that sidewalk outside Kowalski's?" Grant's silence lasted only a second too long. "Grant, I knew the name Vance," Grant said finally, and something in the admission seemed to cost him physically, his shoulders dropping under the weight of it. "Not the way you're thinking. 6 months before I disappeared, my accountant flagged an acquisition offer, crossing my desk Vance Holdings, trying to buy up dock leases along the same stretch of waterfront my father used to work. I recognized the name from an old file my father kept, one I found going through his things after he died. A folder with newspaper clippings and a lawyer's letter, nothing conclusive, nothing I understood at the time. I was 12 when he died, Walt. I didn't understand any of it. I just knew the name Vance made my father's face go gray whenever anyone mentioned the waterfront leases, and I never asked why, because he never wanted to talk about that year at all." "So you knew," Walt said slowly, "and you disappeared onto the same streets that family's company is buying up, and 3 months later you happened to marry into a wedding where the groom who ran off just happens to be Harold Vance's son. You're asking me to believe that's a coincidence. I'm not asking you to believe it's a coincidence." Grant's voice had gone hard now, defensive in a way Walt had almost never heard from him. "I didn't orchestrate meeting Emily, Walt. I didn't know Preston Vance was engaged to anyone, let alone to the woman who'd been bringing me dinner every night for weeks before that wedding ever happened. I went out onto those streets because I couldn't trust anyone in my own life anymore. That part was true, every word of it. But you're right that some part of me went to that particular stretch of the city because it was close to the waterfront my father lost. I wanted to stand on the ground the Vance family took from us and see what it felt like. I never expected any of the rest of it to happen." Walt studied his old friend's face for a long, silent moment, weighing 30 years of trust against the uncomfortable shape of what he'd just heard. "Do you understand how this looks?" he said finally, quieter now. "From the outside, a billionaire with an old, unresolved grudge against the Vance family, disappears onto the exact streets where their business interests overlap with his father's ruin, ends up conveniently married into a scandal involving the son of the man who destroyed his family, and somewhere in all of it there's a woman who's now completely dependent on him, who has no idea any of this history exists. If this ever comes out the way I just laid it out to you, people are going to ask whether Emily was ever really the point at all, Grant, or whether she was just the thread that led you back to the Vance family. The accusation landed like a blow, and for a moment Grant said nothing at all, staring down at his father's name on the old legal filing, as though it might rearrange itself into something less damning. "I love her," he said finally, and his voice, though quiet, carried a certainty that had not wavered once through the entire conversation. "Whatever else is true, whatever tangled, complicated reasons brought me to that sidewalk in the first place, what's grown between Emily and me since then has nothing to do with the Vance family. I need you to believe that." "I want to believe it," Walt said. "I do. But Grant, she doesn't know any of this. Not about the lawsuit, not about your father, not about the fact that the man who stole her savings is the son of the family that bankrupted yours. She's been carrying her own grief around this whole time, thinking it has nothing to do with you, and it turns out the two of you were connected to the same wound long before either of you knew it." He shook his head slowly. "You have to tell her, today, before she finds out some other way and starts wondering what else you haven't told her." Grant closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something in his face had settled into a grim, resolved kind of grief. "I know," he said. "I know I do." He gathered the documents into a neat stack, his hands finally steady now, with the particular calm of a man who has decided, however, reluctantly to walk directly into a fire rather than continue circling it. Outside the kitchen window, the pale morning light had begun to spread thin and gray across the rooftops toward the harbor where Emily was at that very moment, unaware that she was standing on the deck of a wound far older and far deeper than she had ever imagined, a wound about to be laid bare in front of her by the one person she had trusted completely precisely, because he had, until this morning, never once lied to her. Walt watched his oldest friend walk toward the door and felt beneath his own lingering unease something close to sympathy. He had spent 30 years protecting Grant Sorensen from people who might hurt him. He had never once imagined he would spend a single morning helping his friend prepare to hurt someone else, someone who deserved more than almost anyone Walt had ever met, the plain, unvarnished truth. "Grant," he said as his friend reached for the doorknob. Grant paused, looking back. "Whatever she says," Walt said quietly, "however she reacts, don't disappear on her. Not this time. You've done enough disappearing for one lifetime." Grant nodded once and stepped out into the cold morning air to find his wife carrying with him a truth that would either deepen everything that had grown between them these past months, or shatter it completely before it had ever truly begun. The wind off the inlet had picked up by the time Grant reached the dock, carrying the smell of salt and diesel, and the faint sweetness of the smoked salmon Emily had set out on ice an hour earlier. She was crouched behind the folding table, restocking the cooler, her breath fogging in the cold, and when she looked up and saw his face, whatever greeting she'd been about to offer died on her lips. "What's wrong?" she said. Not a question. A woman who had learned over the past several months to read catastrophe in the set of a man's shoulders before he ever opened his mouth. "We need to talk," Grant said. "Not here." She untied her apron without a word, told the woman at the next table she'd be back in 20 minutes, and followed him down the length of the pier to where the crowd of Saturday shoppers thinned into empty planking and gray water. He stopped near the end where the wind was sharpest and no one else could hear, and for a long moment he simply stood there staring out at the water, gathering himself in a way that frightened her more than anything he might have already said. "Grant, you're scaring me." "I know." He turned to face her fully. "And I'm about to scare you more, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything, because if I stop partway through, I don't think I'll find the courage to finish." She nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold, and waited. "My name is Grant Sorensen," he said. "Not just Grant. Sorensen. I own 11 fish processing plants between here and Kodiak. I employ over 600 people. 3 months ago, before I ever sat down outside that hardware store, I was worth more money than I think you could put a real number to, and I walked away from all of it. The office, the house, everything, because I'd reached a point where I couldn't tell anymore who actually cared about me and who only cared about what I could give them. I disguised myself as homeless because I wanted more than anything to find out if there was still one person left in this world who would be kind to a stranger with nothing to offer in return." Emily had gone very still. He watched the information land in stages, confusion first, then disbelief, then something harder settling behind her eyes, as the pieces of the past 3 months began visibly to rearrange themselves into a different shape entirely. She started again. You're not homeless. You've never been homeless. That whole time, every night I brought you food, you had everything, and you just let you believe I had nothing, Grant said quietly. Yes, I'm not going to pretend that's not exactly what I did. Why? Her voice cracked on the single word, more wounded than angry, which somehow made it worse. Why would you let me? I gave you food I couldn't always afford, Grant. I sat on a frozen sidewalk with you because I thought you were alone in the world. I married you because I thought. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. I thought you were the one honest thing left standing in my life. I am, Grant said, taking a step toward her, though he stopped himself before closing the distance completely, some instinct telling him this was not a moment to crowd her. Emily, everything that happened between us, every conversation, every night you sat with me on that sidewalk, none of that was a lie. I never once told you I was someone I wasn't. I just never told you the whole truth of who I was. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one right now. It feels exactly like one right now. She laughed short and bitter, wiping angrily at her eyes with the back of her wrist. God, my mother was right. I married a stranger. I just didn't understand which parts made him a stranger. There's more, Grant said, and something in his voice made her go still again, bracing. He told her the rest of it there on the pier. The wind tearing at both their collars, his father's fishing fleet, the lawsuit filed and dismissed. 26 years earlier, the name Vance Maritime Holdings, buried in an old legal filing his best friend had unearthed only the night before. He told her about Harold Vance, about the acquisition offer that had first put the name back in front of him 6 months before he disappeared, about walking those particular streets, partly, though not entirely, because he had wanted to stand on the ground his father had lost and see what it felt like. Emily's face had gone white by the time he finished, the wind whipping loose strands of hair across her cheek, her eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not fully read, not yet grief, not yet fury, something suspended in the space between the two. Preston's father, she said slowly, is the same man who destroyed your father's business. Yes, and you knew that. Before any of this happened. Before you ever sat down outside that hardware store. I knew the name, Grant said. I didn't know Preston was engaged. I didn't know he was engaged to you. I promise you, Emily, I had no idea any of that was connected until Walt found the paperwork last night. But I understand. I do understand why that isn't enough to make this feel like coincidence to you right now. Isn't enough. Her voice had gone dangerously quiet. Grant, do you have any idea how this sounds? You had a 2 decades-old grudge against a family you happened to wander onto the exact streets where their business was expanding. And 3 months later, you ended up married to the one woman in this city who'd just been personally destroyed by that same family's son. You're standing here telling me I should believe all of that just happened. I know how it sounds. Do you? Something in her had cracked open now, all the careful composure of the last month finally giving way. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like I might have been useful to you, Grant. A convenient thread that happened to lead you exactly where you already wanted to go. And I don't know. I genuinely don't know how much of what's happened between us since that wedding was real. And how much of it was just you following a plan you'd already set in motion long before you ever met me. Everything since that night has been real. His voice broke slightly on the words raw in a way she had never heard from him. Emily, I have not been performing anything with you. Not the sidewalk, not the fever, not the dock, not one single moment of these past months. If you take nothing else from this conversation, please believe that. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gray water, her arms still wrapped tight around herself, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had gone flat with exhaustion rather than anger. I need to be alone for a while, she said. Not forever. I'm not saying I'm leaving. I just need to think, and I can't do that standing here looking at you right now. Okay. Grant made no move to stop her, though. Everything in him wanted to. Take whatever time you need. She turned and walked back down the pier alone, her figure growing smaller against the gray sweep of the harbor, and Grant stood at the railing long after she'd disappeared from sight, the wind cutting through the same threadbare coat he'd worn on the night they first met, thinking of his mother's photograph tucked warm against his chest of 2 decades of silence. He had never once found the courage to break, and of how easily the truth, once finally spoken, could cost a man the one thing his silence had never managed to protect after all. Behind him, further down the dock, Walt watched the whole exchange from a careful distance, his hands jammed deep in his coat pockets, and felt for the first time since he'd opened that folder the night before, a genuine and unfamiliar fear, not that Emily Carter had ever been anything other than exactly what she appeared to be, but that the truth Grant had just laid bare might cost him her trust before either of them ever had the chance to build something strong enough to survive it. Emily did not go home. She walked instead along the harbor path until the wind off the water had scoured her thoughts down to something clearer, colder, more honest than the tangle of hurt and disbelief that had carried her off the pier an hour earlier. She thought of her father, of the particular uncomplicated way he had loved her mother, even through the worst years of debt and worry. Love isn't the absence of complications, he used to say. It's what you do with them once they show up. She had spent so many years resenting that sentiment, watching it fail to protect her mother from grief after his death, that she had almost forgotten it might still be true. By the time she found her way back to the small apartment above the laundromat, the light outside had gone, the deep bruised blue of an Anchorage evening in early autumn, and Grant was sitting exactly where she'd expected him to be at, the kitchen table unmoving, his mother's photograph laid flat in front of him like a confession he hadn't yet found the courage to finish making. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face braced for the worst. "I'm not leaving," she said before he could speak, closing the door behind her. "I want you to know that first, because I could see it in your face just now, and I don't want you carrying that fear for one more second than you have to. Emily, let me finish." She crossed the small room and sat down across from him, her coat still damp from the wind, and folded her hands on the table between them. "I walked for an hour trying to decide whether I could forgive you for not telling me everything from the start. And here's what I landed on. You could have orchestrated the timeline. You could have known Preston's family history and used it calculated cold exactly the way it sounds when Walt lays it out on paper. But you can't fake the way you looked at me every night on that sidewalk before you had any reason to think I mattered to your plan at all. You can't fake how your hands shook the first time you mentioned your mother. Those weren't performances, Grant. I've spent enough of my life around men who perform sincerity to know the difference." Grant said nothing, his throat working, and Emily reached across the table and laid her hand gently over the old photograph, over the faded image of a woman with his same pale eyes. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "Really tell me. Not the version you give Walt. The whole thing." And so for the first time in over 20 years, Grant told someone everything: the raised voices behind the closed bedroom door, the stranger's car idling at the end of the driveway in the rain, his mother's shoulders shaking as she stood outside talking to a man Grant had never been able to identify, in the silence the next morning, absolute and permanent, that had swallowed his childhood whole. He told her about his father's slow collapse in the years that followed, about the boats sold one by one, about a heart that had simply stopped one gray October morning under a weight no doctor had ever been able to fully name. He told her finally the belief he had carried like a stone at the center of himself for 2 decades, that when the money disappeared, his mother had chosen to disappear along with it, that whatever love she'd shown him in those first 12 years had, in the end, weighed less than comfort. Emily listened without interrupting, without offering the easy, useless reassurances people so often reach for in the presence of grief that large. When he finally fell silent, she did not tell him it would be okay. She simply reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. "You built an entire empire," she said softly, trying to answer a question your mother's silence left open. "And you've never once let yourself actually go looking for the real answer, because some part of you would rather live with the story you already have than risk finding out the truth is even worse." Grant's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, because she had named with unbearable precision the exact fear he had carried since he was 12 years old. "What if she really did just leave?" he said, finally, his voice raw. "What if the truth is exactly as small and as simple as I've always assumed? What if I go looking, and there's nothing there except confirmation of the thing I've spent my whole life trying not to believe?" "Then at least you'll know," Emily said. "And you won't be 12 years old anymore, carrying it alone in the dark. You'll have me, whatever you find." She tightened her grip on his hands. "You can't sort out what happened to your family, Grant, if you're only willing to look at the parts of the story that don't scare you. You have to go all the way in. And I think some part of you has known that for a long time, and you've just never had anyone worth risking the answer for." Something in Grant's chest, some knot he had carried so long, he'd forgotten it was possible to loosen it, gave way slightly, and for the first time in over 20 years, he let himself cry in front of another person, not the careful and contained grief of a funeral, but something older, rawer, finally given permission to surface. The next morning Grant called Walt, before he'd even finished his coffee. "I want everything," he said. Every filing, every record, anything connected to the Vance family and my father's old business from that year. And I want you to find out what actually happened to my mother. Not the story I've been telling myself. The truth. Whatever it costs. Walt was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. You sure about that? No, Grant admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. It took Walt 11 days. He found it in the end, not in a court filing or a property record, but in a decades-old settlement agreement, buried in a private legal archive. Vance Holdings had long assumed no one would ever think to request a non-disclosure. Financial settlement dated 8 days after the night. Grant's mother disappeared in the amount of $150,000 paid to a woman named Sarah Sorensen, in exchange for her agreement never to discuss in any forum any allegations she had made or intended to make regarding Vance Maritime Holdings' business practices. Walt sat with the document for a long time before he called Grant, understanding with a cold, sick certainty exactly what it meant. Sarah Sorensen had not left her family because the money was gone. She had discovered something about Harold Vance's business dealings, something serious enough that Vance had been willing to pay a small fortune and very likely make threats no document would ever record to ensure her silence. She had not chosen comfort over her son. She had been driven out, quietly and completely to protect him, and had spent as far as Walt could determine from a scattering of old employment records under a slightly altered name, the next 26 years, working a modest, anonymous life at a small, fish processing operation less than 2 miles from the glass office tower her own son would one day build. She was, as far as Walt could tell, still alive. Walt drove to the apartment above the laundromat that evening, the settlement agreement clutched in one hand, and found Grant and Emily sitting together at the small kitchen table, exactly where they'd been sitting 11 days earlier. When this search had begun, he set the document down between them without a word, and watched his oldest friend's face move in the space of a single silent minute, through disbelief, grief, fury, and something that looked unmistakably like hope. "She's alive," Walt said quietly. "Grant, she's alive, and I think I know where." 2 weeks later, the ballroom of the Dena'ina Civic and Convention Center glittered under a canopy of white lights. 300 of the most influential names in Alaska's maritime and real estate industries gathered for the annual Pacific Northwest Fisheries Gala, an event Grant Sorensen had not attended or even acknowledged, existed in nearly 4 months. His absence had generated its own quiet storm of speculation across the industry. Rumors of a breakdown, a hostile takeover in progress, a man who had simply walked away from the empire his father's ruin had taught him to build. He walked through the doors that evening in a tailored charcoal suit, Emily on his arm in a deep green gown that made no attempt to apologize for where she'd come from, and the room went silent in stages the way a stone dropped into. Still, water sends its rings outward long after the splash itself has settled. Grant Sorensen, someone near the bar, murmured, disbelieving. That's actually him." Harold Vance stood near the center of the room, champagne in hand, holding court with a cluster of investors, and Grant watched the older man's face shift through recognition, calculation, and finally a thin, practiced smile as he turned to greet the crowd's returning prodigal. "Grant." Harold extended a hand, warm and easy, the handshake of a man who had spent decades believing his sins buried deeply enough to never resurface. "We'd heard rumors you'd taken some kind of sabbatical. Glad to see the reports of your disappearance were exaggerated." "Not exaggerated," Grant said, and something in his voice made several nearby conversations quietly falter. "Just purposeful." Preston stood a few feet behind his father, visibly uncomfortable, his eyes flicking toward Emily with the particular guilt of a man who had assumed wrongly that the consequences of his cruelty would remain conveniently confined to a single humiliating night, 4 months earlier, and never follow him to a room full of people whose opinions actually mattered to his family's business. "Emily." Preston's voice came out strangled, half apology, half warning. "I didn't expect—" "No," Emily said evenly, "I don't imagine you did." Grant raised a hand, and the small orchestra at the far end of the room, cued weeks in advance, brought its current number to a graceful, natural close. Into the resulting hush, Grant stepped forward, unhurried, a man who had spent 3 months learning exactly how much power lived in stillness. "Before the evening continues," he said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom, "I'd like to say a few words. It's been a strange year for my family, and I think most of you deserve to understand why." Harold's smile had not moved, but something behind his eyes had gone sharp and watchful. 26 years ago, Grant continued, my father, Michael Sorensen, ran a small fishing fleet out of Ship Creek. 3 boats. A modest operation but an honest one, and it fed our family and 6 other families besides. That year, he entered into a partnership with a company called Vance Maritime Holdings. A murmur rippled through the crowd, several older attendees exchanging glances, remembering a name most had assumed long dissolved into the industry's distant past, a partnership that, within a single season, stripped my father of his most valuable fishing rights, through what his own lawsuit alleged was deliberate, fraudulent misrepresentation. That lawsuit was dismissed after 4 months, not because my father was wrong, but because he ran out of money to keep fighting a company with considerably deeper pockets than his own. Grant Harold said, his voice carrying a warning now beneath its practiced calm. This is neither the time, nor the "I'm not finished." Grant's voice did not rise, but it did not yield either. My father died 8 months after his fleet was sold at auction. I was 12 years old, and that same year my mother disappeared from our home without explanation, a disappearance I spent over 2 decades believing was a choice she made to escape a family that no longer had anything to offer her. The room had gone entirely still now, 300 people frozen mid-drink, mid-conversation, sensing the shape of something they would be discussing for years to come. I was wrong, Grant said. My mother did not leave because the money disappeared. She left because she discovered something about Vance Maritime Holdings' business practices that year. Something serious enough that she was prepared to speak about it publicly. 2 weeks after my father's lawsuit was dismissed, my mother accepted a settlement of $150,000 from Vance Maritime Holdings under a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for her silence and her permanent disappearance from our lives. She did not abandon her son. She was paid, and quite likely threatened into vanishing to keep a truth buried that this family has spent 26 years successfully hiding. Harold's face had gone the color of old paper, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. That is a serious accusation to make in a room full of witnesses, he said, low and dangerous without a shred of proof. I have the settlement agreement, Grant said. Signed, dated, notarized, and filed under a private legal archive your firm assumed would never be examined again. I also have my father's original lawsuit, the fraudulent partnership contracts underlying it, and a sworn statement from the attorney who drafted your family's original settlement offer 26 years ago, who has since, motivated, I imagine, by a conscience your family never managed to purchase, along with everything else, agreed to testify to its circumstances. Grant's voice hardened further. And as for the newest generation of the Vance family's business practices, I imagine most of you in this room already know at least part of that story. 4 months ago, your son emptied the entire savings account of the woman standing beside me the night before their wedding and disappeared with the money to close on a property in Seward. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward Preston, who had gone pale and rigid, his mouth working without producing sound. That's not he started. That was a private matter that has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with this, Grant said. Because the pattern your family has built across 2 generations is the same pattern, Preston. Take what isn't offered freely. Use whatever leverage is available, money threats, a well-timed disappearance, and trust that the people you've harmed won't have the resources to fight back. My father didn't. My mother couldn't. Emily very nearly couldn't either, until she happened to show a stranger on a sidewalk more kindness than your entire family has shown anyone in 26 years. A murmur of open disgust moved through the room now, the crowd's collective sympathy shifting visibly, decisively away from the Vance family and toward the man standing at its center. 2 men near the door, attorneys Grant had quietly retained weeks earlier, present at his specific request, stepped forward, and the low, formal exchange that followed, though largely inaudible to the wider room, ended with a pair of Anchorage police detectives entering through the ballroom side doors. Having been summoned in advance and briefed on the fraud charges, Grant's legal team had spent the past 2 weeks meticulously preparing financial fraud connected to Emily's stolen savings, and a fresh civil filing reopening with dramatically stronger evidence, the 26-year-old claims of Michael Sorensen's original lawsuit. This is outrageous, Harold said, backing a step as one of the detectives approached him, his composure finally completely cracking. You cannot simply— I can, Grant said quietly, and I have. You spent 26 years believing my family's silence was permanent. You were wrong about that too. Emily stood beside him through all of it, her hand steady in his, watching a man who had spent months learning to accept love without flinching now stand in front of an entire industry and finally publicly refuse to carry his family's shame in silence any longer. She thought of the sidewalk outside Kowalski's diner, of a stranger in a threadbare coat who had never once asked her for anything, and understood, watching Harold and Preston Vance being led from the ballroom under the stunned gaze of 300 witnesses, that the man beside her had not been rescued by his own wealth tonight at all. He had been freed by the truth, and by having for the first time in over 2 decades, someone standing close enough beside him to help him carry it. The police cars had barely pulled away from the Denina Center, their taillights fading into the wet Anchorage night, when Walt found Grant standing alone near the emptied coat check, still in his charcoal suit, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline of confrontation had begun to drain out of him. "You did it," Walt said quietly, coming to stand beside his oldest friend. 26 years and you did it. "It doesn't feel like I expected it to," Grant admitted. "I thought there'd be more relief. There's something else you need to see first." Walt's voice carried a careful, deliberate calm, the tone of a man who had spent the last several hours holding something enormous very still, so as not to drop it before the right moment. "The address, I found the one connected to the name on that old employment record. I drove past it myself this afternoon before the gala just to be sure." He paused. "Grant, she's there. Right now. I confirmed it with my own eyes." Grant went very still. Beside him, Emily's hand found his steady and warm. "Take us," he said. They drove in near silence through streets slick with the season's first real snow, past the harbor, past the glass tower that bore the Sorensen name in brushed steel letters, 3 stories tall, out toward a modest residential stretch on the edge of Mountain View where the houses grew smaller and the streetlights grew farther apart. Walt pulled the truck to a stop outside a small, well-kept duplex with a single porch light burning against the dark. A wreath of dried beach grass hung on the door, despite the season being months from any holiday. The particular small vanity of someone who simply liked the way it looked. "She works the early shift at a processing plant 2 streets over," Walt said quietly, killing the engine. "Sorts and packages mostly. Goes by Sarah Nolan now. Been there almost 19 years according to the plant's payroll records. Quiet, reliable, keeps to herself. Nobody there has any idea who she used to be." Grant sat in the passenger seat for a long moment, staring at the small yellow square of the porch light, his chest rising and falling with the particular effort of a man trying to hold himself together through sheer will. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" he said so quietly, Walt almost missed it. "What if 26 years was long enough that whatever she felt for me back then is just gone? What if I knock on that door and she looks at me like a stranger?" "Then you'll know," Emily said gently, echoing, without either of them fully realizing it, the same words she had offered him weeks earlier at the kitchen table. "And whatever happens, you won't be 12 years old standing in an empty house wondering. You'll be a grown man and you won't be alone." Grant nodded once and opened the truck door before he could talk himself out of it. The walk up the short concrete path felt to him longer than any distance he had ever crossed, longer than the years he'd spent building an empire out of a silence he had never understood, longer than the 3 months he'd spent sleeping on frozen sidewalks, searching for something he could not yet name. He raised his hand to knock and found it shaking. The door opened before his knuckles ever made contact. The woman standing in the doorway was smaller than he remembered. Her dark hair gone mostly silver, now threaded through with the particular kind of gray that comes not just from age but from years spent carrying something heavy and alone. But her eyes, pale gray, exactly the shade Grant saw every morning in his own mirror, had not changed at all, and the moment they landed on his face, something in them broke open completely. "Grant." Her voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelieving, as though she had spent 26 years rehearsing this exact moment and had never once actually believed it would arrive. "Oh God. Grant. Mom." The word came out of him cracked and raw, a word he had not spoken aloud to anyone in over 2 decades. Sarah Nolan. Sarah Sorensen pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, tears already streaming freely down her face, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, standing frozen on either side of a threshold, 26 years in the making, as though some part of each of them still could not fully trust that the other was real. "I thought I'd lost you completely," she said finally, her voice breaking apart with every word. "I thought Harold Vance told me if I ever came near you, if I ever tried to explain, he'd make sure you and your father suffered far worse than anything a lawsuit could accomplish. I believed him. God help me, Grant, I believed him, and I let that fear keep me away from my own son for 26 years. I know," Grant said, his own voice breaking now, tears he had not allowed himself in decades finally spilling freely down his face. Walt found the settlement. "I know what really happened. I know you didn't leave because you stopped loving me. I never stopped for one single day." Sarah reached out her hand, hovering uncertainly for a moment before she finally gently pressed it against his cheek, the way she must have done 1,000 times when he was a small child, and the gesture had cost her nothing at all. "I used to drive past your office building, you know, years ago before you built the new tower. I'd sit in my car across the street just to watch people come and go, hoping I might catch a glimpse of you. Too afraid to ever get close enough to be seen. A small, broken laugh escaped her. My son, look at you. Look at everything you built. I built all of it trying to prove I was worth staying for. Grant admitted the confession costing him everything and somehow nothing at all in the same breath. I spent 20 years believing you left because we didn't have enough to offer you anymore. Oh, Grant. Sarah's face crumpled with a fresh wave of grief. You had everything to offer me. You were everything. Leaving you was the only thing in my entire life. I have never once forgiven myself for even knowing it was the only way I believed I could keep you safe. They stood together in the doorway for a long time after that mother and son, 26 years of silence finally breaking open between them, while behind them at the bottom of the concrete path, Walt and Emily stood back respectfully in the cold, watching a wound neither of them had ever fully understood begin at last to close. Emily reached for Walt's hand without thinking, and he let her take it. Both of them watching Grant Sorensen, billionaire, self-made, the most powerful man on the Anchorage waterfront, stand on a stranger's porch and weep like the 12-year-old boy. He had never quite stopped, being finally held after 2.5 decades by the one person whose absence had shaped the entire architecture of the man he'd become. I should have trusted her from the start, Walt said quietly, watching Emily's face in the porch light. You. I should have trusted you from the start, and I'm sorry it took me this long to admit it. You were protecting him, Emily said, her eyes never leaving Grant and his mother. I can't fault you for that. I think in the end we both wanted the exact same thing. We just went about proving it differently. Sarah eventually stepped back from her son, wiping at her eyes, and looked past him toward the two figures still standing at the bottom of the walkway. Is that, she asked softly. Grant, who is that with you? Grant turned, reaching a hand back toward Emily, who came forward now, her own eyes bright with tears. She made no effort to hide. This is Emily, he said, and something in his voice, saying her name in front of his mother for the first time, carried a tenderness Sarah recognized immediately, having spent a lifetime learning to read exactly this kind of love in the small, unguarded moments of ordinary people. My wife, the reason I finally had the courage to come looking for you at all. Sarah looked at Emily for a long moment, taking in the whole of her, the kindness visible even now, exhausted and cold, and standing at the edge of someone else's reunion without a trace of impatience. And then she reached out and pulled Emily into an embrace as fierce and unguarded as the one she'd given her own son moments before. Thank you, Sarah whispered against Emily's shoulder. Thank you for bringing him home. And there on a small porch in Mountain View, under a single burning light, 26 years of silence finally gave way to something Grant Sorensen had spent his entire adult life building empires in a desperate, unspoken attempt to purchase: not wealth, not power, not vindication, but simply this, a family gathered close, refusing any longer to let each other disappear. 1 year later, the wedding took place at the same small dock where Carter's Catch had first opened its folding table on a cold Saturday morning, the planking strung now with simple white lights instead of a hand-lettered sign, the autumn air carrying the same familiar scent of salt and diesel that had once meant nothing more to Emily than the smell of another long shift, and now meant quite simply home. There was no ballroom this time, no string quartet, no 200 curious strangers waiting to see how the evening might collapse, just a small gathering of people who had earned their place there through something more durable than an invitation list. Mrs. Kowalski, who cried through the entire ceremony and insisted, despite Grant's gentle protests, on catering the reception herself. A handful of Emily's former co-workers from the plant, who had quietly reached out in the months after the gala to apologize for their silence during her hardest weeks, and Sarah Sorensen standing near the front in a simple blue dress, her hand resting every so often on her son's arm, as though she still could not quite believe she was allowed to. Walt stood beside Grant at the altar, having traded in his role as skeptical protector for something he wore far more easily. Now best man, uncle-in-waiting, the man who had once filled a legal pad with suspicious notes about a woman he now considered without a trace of irony family. Never thought I'd stand up here for you twice, Walt murmured to Grant as the small crowd settled into folding chairs. Glad this is the one that stuck. Me too, Grant said, watching the dock's entrance for the first sight of Emily. Me too, Walt. When she appeared walking down the short aisle between the folding chairs in a simple ivory dress, instead of the elaborate gown from a year before, there were no gasps. This time no phones raised to capture scandal, only quiet, genuine tears, the particular kind that come from watching two people finally arrive somewhere they had, both in their own ways, spent a lifetime trying to reach. Harold and Preston Vance had been convicted 8 months earlier. Harold on charges of fraud and witness intimidation stretching back over 2 decades. Preston on charges connected to the theft of Emily's savings and a pattern of similar schemes prosecutors uncovered once they began looking closely at his financial history. Vance Holdings had been dissolved, its remaining assets absorbed into settlements for the families it had harmed across nearly 3 decades, including at last, a long overdue judgment, restoring what remained recoverable of Michael Sorensen's original fishing rights, transferred quietly into a scholarship fund. Grant established in his father's name for the children of Alaska fishing families who could not otherwise afford to attend college. Sarah Sorensen had moved out of the small Mountain View duplex and into a modest house near her son and daughter-in-law, close enough to visit for dinner most Sundays, far enough to keep the independence she had fought so hard for, so many years to hold on to. She still worked 2 mornings a week at the processing plant, not out of necessity anymore, but because she told Emily once quietly over coffee, "The work reminds me I built a life of my own, even in the years I thought I'd lost everything." Grant had stopped somewhere in the past year trying to fill the silence his mother's absence had left with anything else. He had simply let her back in slowly, patiently, the way you let, feeling back into a limb that has gone numb for too long, painful at first and then gradually whole. As the ceremony ended, and the small crowd rose to applaud, Emily looked out at the gathered faces at Mrs. Kowalski, dabbing her eyes with a napkin at Walt, grinning like a man who had finally stopped bracing for disaster at Sarah Sorensen, watching her son with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy, and thought of a snowy evening over a year earlier, when she had crouched beside a stranger on a frozen sidewalk with nothing to offer him but a foil-wrapped plate of meatloaf and a little warmth in a world that had taught her over and over to expect very little in return. She had not known that night that kindness could travel so far. She had only known that a person was cold, and that cold does not wait to find out whether someone deserves to be helped before it settles into the bones. That in the end was the whole of what this story had to teach, not a lesson about wealth or disguise or the particular drama of a billionaire testing the world's honesty, but something far simpler and far more enduring that the way we treat people who appear to have nothing to offer us reveals more about our own hearts than almost anything else we do. Emily had not known Grant's name, his fortune, or his history the night she first knelt beside him in the snow. She had only known he was hungry and that she had a little to spare. Everything that followed the marriage, the reckoning with the Vance family, the healing of a wound 26 years old had grown from that single unremarkable act of decency offered without any expectation of return. And Grant, for his part, had spent a lifetime believing that love had to be earned through what a person could provide, only to learn in the end that the truest love he ever received had been offered to him precisely when he appeared to have nothing left to give. His mother had loved him enough to disappear rather than let him be harmed. Emily had loved him before she ever knew what he was worth. Walt had loved him enough to risk their friendship by asking hard, uncomfortable questions rather than staying comfortably silent. None of that love had required him to be powerful or wealthy or impressive. It had only ever required him to be honest and present and willing at last to let himself be known. As the last of the evening light faded gold over Cook Inlet and the small gathering moved toward the tables, Mrs. Kowalski had spent all afternoon arranging Grant, took Emily's hand in his, feeling the same steady warmth he had felt the very first night she had crouched beside him on a frozen sidewalk with a plate of food and nothing to gain, understood more fully than he ever had before that the richest inheritance his father had ever left him was not a fishing fleet or a fortune, or even the empire he had built in its place. It was the simple, hard-won knowledge that kindness offered freely and without condition has a way of finding its way home again, sometimes after 26 years, and sometimes on the very same night it is given. That's where we leave Grant and Emily's story, a story about pride and pain, about a family broken apart and slowly, painfully put back together, and about the quiet, unglamorous kind of kindness that so often goes unnoticed until the moment it changes everything. If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this: you never really know what someone else is carrying, and you never know how far a small act of compassion might travel once you let it go. The people who need kindness most rarely look like they deserve a second glance, and that is exactly the moment it matters most. We'd love to know, what lesson did you take away from this story? Was it about the danger of judging others by what they appear to have or don't have? Was it about the courage it takes to forgive, or the quiet strength it takes to keep loving someone, even when the truth is complicated? Leave a comment below and let us know what stayed with you. And if this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you again in the next video.